I just meant I'm sure that one topic that all of us have been aware of in the news is the fact that now, quite a time, almost 3 weeks after the presidential election was held, nobody really knows for sure who the new president's going to be. And this, of course, has made a lot of lawyers happy. I suspect there will be a number of lawyers be able to retire after this deal is over. They will have spent so much time there in Florida. But there's, a very marked contrast between the governmental confusion in this world and the government that you and I are preparing to enter. Even in the midst of all this confusion that's going on and in terms of choosing a president and trying to know exactly which man is going to be inducted into office in January, one of the things that both of them have had to be concerned about, even in the midst of all this turmoil, is thinking about a transition. Because come 22nd of January, somebody's going to be, or 20th of January, somebody's going to be, sworn in as president. There's got to be somebody that takes the office, holds the office, and there has to be some sort of transition. Now, while they're thinking in terms of a transition, and they're preparing for a transition that may only last 4 years, then perhaps somebody else will come along. You and I certainly need to be thinking in terms of a governmental transition that's going to take place. It's going to take place in the lifetime of most of us. It's going to directly involve us. And it's going to be a transition that simply is not going to usher in a government that's going to last for 4 years, or maybe 8, if everything goes well. But we're talking about a government that is going to stretch out for a 1,000-year term, and then in reality stretch on out into eternity beyond that. Yet, so often the transition in government that you and I are preparing or are, let's say, going to be directly involved in can somehow seem remote. It can seem far off. It can seem less real than all of the confusion and things that are going on right now. It's interesting. A lot of things get buried in the process because the American political situation has certainly dominated attention in the media. But one thing you might want to keep your eyes open, and that is the fact it's very likely that this Monday the Israeli Parliament convened, and very likely that there's going to be a vote of confidence, and Prime Minister Barak seems to be on the verge of resigning. He has made the statement that he has no partner for peace in terms of the Middle East among the Arabs, and he has no partner for governing among the Jews. So he appears to be headed on his way out, and if he staves it off, it's just going to be temporary. We are in a period where there are a number of very weak governments. Our government that will ultimately come in is going to be a very divided government, and certainly greatly weakened, not one that's going to have a lot of popular enthusiasm and support. Rather, the nation is very, very closely divided, and pretty well you can guarantee that about half the population is going to be most unhappy when the new president is sworn in, because about half the population will be convinced that whoever's being sworn in stole the election from their guy. I think that's fairly safe to say when you look at how divided things are. It's quite a contrast. We think in this country, in terms of choosing our leader and choosing the president, Jesus Christ made a statement in John chapter 15. John chapter 15 and verse 16, Jesus said, "You have not chosen me, but I have chosen you and ordained you. You should go and bring forth fruit, that your fruit should remain. Whatsoever you shall ask of the Father in my name, He may give it you." Jesus said, "You've not chosen me. You've not elected me." Same word, by the way. It's translated elect or election. There are elections in the kingdom of God. We're God's elect. The only thing is, there's only one vote in the election. That's God's. God elects us. He chooses us. Jesus said, you've not chosen me. You didn't get together and I said, well, I'd really like to be the Messiah. And so get a bunch of people together and say, yeah, he's our man to be the Messiah. We'll choose him. We'll give you our support and we'll try to get you into office as the Messiah. We want to get you in. You've not chosen me. You weren't the ones who decided that I could be the Messiah. No, rather, I've chosen you. I've chosen you. I have selected you. I've ordained you. I have given you a job. I've given you a commission. Quite a contrast in terms of God's government and the governments of this world. You see, one of the first contrasts is who does the choosing. Who does the choosing? Well, God's government is structured from the top down. God the Father is the top. Who chose Jesus Christ? The disciples didn't choose Christ. God the Father chose Jesus Christ to come as the Messiah. God the Father appointed him. And Christ talked about that. He said, you just notice here, back in Revelation chapter 2. Revelation chapter 2 and verse 26, Jesus said, he that overcomes and keeps my works unto the end, to him will I give power over the nations. That's government. Jesus Christ talked about giving power over the nations. Far more power than the President of the United States exercises. Far more power than any particular government leader in today's world. Jesus Christ talked about the inauguration of a literal government. He that overcomes and keeps my works unto the end, to him will I give power over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. As the vessels of a potter shall they be broken to shivers, even as I received of my Father. Jesus Christ is going to give power, and those who receive that power will rule, even as I received of my Father. You see, Jesus Christ received a government. Will receive a government from his Father. And Christ carries out that government just as the Father instructed him, even as I have received of my Father. So Christ carries out a government that is based on pleasing the Father, not based on pleasing people. So many times one of the problems that comes about, ultimately, as Jeremiah says, it's not, he says, O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It's not in man that walks to direct his steps. There are fatal flaws built into everything that man's system produces. Because ultimately, man's system is based on what? Man's whole civilization goes back to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, the tree was not just the tree of evil. It was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It is a mixture. Now, sometimes human society, human civilization, in certain areas has reflected more good and less evil. Sometimes it's reflected more evil and less good. But it's always included that fatal mixture. Now, the more good and the less evil, the more stable and the longer it'll endure. The more evil and the less good, then obviously the more fatally flawed, the more quickly that may be the case. But man's civilizations, man's societies, man's governments are based upon that mixture of good and evil. And that has ensured that nothing man builds endures on a permanent basis. Adolf Hitler set out to build a 1,000-year Reich. That's what he talked about, Sort of interesting. Where do you think he came up with that number? A 1,000-year Reich. Well, he, in effect, was sort of viewing himself that he was going to bring the millennium. Now, it didn't work out that way. He came to power in Germany in 1933, and by 1945, he was dead in his bunker, and his Reich lay in ruin. Didn't last, didn't endure. But Jesus Christ is going to build a government, and his government is going to be obviously based on pleasing the Father. Now, so many of man's governments have to be based on trying to curry favor with people. And so politicians run for office and they promise people things. It's like, we'll give you more than the other guy's going to give you. And, we've seen that and over a period of decades, the extent to which so much has become a contest as to who can promise more. Well, if the main endeavor is to make people happy, number one, you find out that it won't work because sooner or later people get dissatisfied. You didn't fix everything. You didn't solve all their problems. You didn't make them happy. You didn't usher in the millennium like you said you would. So dissatisfaction sets in. You know, most governments, when they come to power, there's a certain enthusiasm and excitement about it. Now, just down in Peru, they've just had a change of government. President Fujimori, who had been president for 10 years, resigned. And it was sort of a choice between resigning and being overthrown or kicked out or arrested. And there's quite a stir going on. But, you know, it's interesting. You look back 10 years ago, he was a very popular fellow when he took office. He was going to clean things up. He came in and he was popular, and everybody just knew he was going to solve all the problems. 10 years later, he's viewed as a crook, and they're mad at him, want to get rid of him. They got another fellow in now, and he's pretty popular. You know, he's going to solve things. What do you say? Give him a few years. Wonder how popular he'll be in 5 years or 10 years, or even if he'll be in office in 5 years or 10 years. You know, you find across the world someone comes to power, and they're generally popular for a little while because they've made promises, and people are dissatisfied with the last fellow. But when the new one gets in, there are other problems and other difficulties. Jesus Christ's government is based not on trying to curry favor, but on pleasing the Father. Now, we're going to see a little more about that in a moment. But you see, Christ said, you didn't choose me, I chose you. And that is a fundamental thing in God's government. We're going to look at three. I want to call your attention here to three fundamental areas of the government of God that are different than the governments of men, the governments of this world. Number one, God's government is from the top down, God the Father being the top. God's government is from the top down. It is based on choosing from the top down, not from bottom up. It is also another aspect. That's not the only aspect of God's government. You know, there have been governments in many pagan nations that Babylon and Egypt had government from the top down. The king was the top. That was the problem. Pharaoh was the top. You remember the law of the Medes and the Persians. Whatever the king said, that was it. And if he said, you don't bow down to my image, I'm going to throw you in a fiery furnace. You pray to anybody but me, I'm going to put you in the den with the lions. The king was the king. So there has to be more to right government than government from the top down. God's government is from the top down. God's government is also what we would term a constitutional government. And the Constitution is the law of God. God's government is based upon law. Now, most human governments, there are two basic approaches if you look at democracy versus totalitarian dictatorship. The dictatorship is based on the whim of one man, whatever he says. You know, the government of the Medes and the Persians, the government of Babylon was a totalitarian dictatorship. The king said, everybody prays to me for the next month. Then everybody prayed to him. That was what he wanted to do. That was the law of the Medes and the Persians. You don't do it, we're going to throw you in with the lions. You can go back and read the story in the book of Daniel. You know, his buddies are some of the ones who really had an ulterior motive. They wanted to get Daniel. But they came to the king and they persuaded him to do this. And once he had done it, it was done. Because you see, for the king to rescind a law was to admit that he made a mistake. And the kings of the Medes and the Persians never made a mistake. Or at least they never admitted to making a mistake. So here this king issues this dumb decree, which in the aftermath he recognized was a pretty dumb decree. It never dawned on him. It just didn't click as to what was going on. Which again tells you something about the governments of this world and the fact of people being conned, being seduced, being sort of tricked, being flattered. You know, these fellows came to this king and they flattered his vanity. They got him to sign this stupid decree. All the while, they were plotting. They wanted to get Daniel. And they knew that Daniel, they were jealous of Daniel. They were envious. And again, we see human nature hasn't changed a whole lot. But Daniel was a man of ability and he was a man of integrity. And so what were they going to accuse him of? They wanted to get Daniel in bad with the king because they wanted what Daniel had. They couldn't say Daniel was incompetent. Daniel was a very capable man. He had everything lined up. He was efficient. He was capable, very competent. So they couldn't find fault with him in that way. He was very honest. He was faithful and loyal to the king, and very honest in carrying out things. He wasn't cheating people. He wasn't lining his pockets. He wasn't abusing his office. So they looked and they scrutinized, and they could find nothing that was valid for which they could accuse Daniel. So because they couldn't find something of value, something of real consequence, they decided to work out something. The only way that they could see that they would be able to get at Daniel was in something concerning his God. They knew that if Daniel was loyal and faithful to the king, but he was loyal and faithful to God first. And so they got the king to agree to this about praying to anyone except the king. And Daniel was a man who would not even give the appearance of evil. Daniel faithfully prayed 3 times every day, and he continued on. Daniel did not want to even give the impression that he had abandoned his God. And, of course, you remember the story. God took care of Daniel. And the king, by this time, when that was over with and he knew what these fellows were up to, he said, I'll tell you what, now Daniel's gotten out of the lion dens, we're going to throw you in. And you just pray to me for all your work while you're down there. Daniel's God closed the mouths of the lions. We'll see what your prayers get accomplished. Well, I suspect the lions have just had an opportunity to work up a good appetite by that time. You imagine, this old lion, he's down there 24 hours and an angel has his mouth shut. And all the while, this lion is looking at dinner. And he is just, he's just drooling. But he can't get his mouth open. You talk about one frustrated lion, I'll tell you what, somebody holds your mouth shut 24 hours, you are not going to be a happy camper by the time you get it open. And the lion undoubtedly was not in a good mood. So, things have a way of working out. But God's government was not simply based on the whim of one man. I'll show you that in a minute, and how it differed from the governments of Babylon and Egypt. You see, in the world, governments, either you have a dictatorship based on the whim of one man, or you have a democracy which is based on the whim of the majority, whatever they sort of feel like at the moment. You hear about this fellow running he's the leader of one of the opposition parties up in Canada, and they're having elections in Canada this coming week. And what is his sort of an odd first name? Stanford Day or something along that line. Anyway, he had come out with a real proposal. He said he thought that if 3% of the population, 3% of the voters, signed a petition for anything, he would put it on the ballot and give everybody a chance to vote on it. He thought, So immediately, some DJ came up with the idea that put out a petition that for everybody who thought that Stanford Day ought to have to change his name to Doris Day, signed the petition. Well, he got almost 1 million signatures on his petition, which was about 10% of the Canadian voters. So he said, well, I think this ought to go on the ballot. You're a politician, a man of your word. You say you're going to put anything on the ballot, you think the majority ought to decide. So we ought to decide what your first name's going to be. And a lot of us think it ought to be Doris. You see, there are dangers to just sort of going with the whim of the majority. I suspect they put it on the ballot. There may be a lot of folks who really think that'd be funny. He may find that Doris would sort of win hands down. I don't know, but I think they probably have the fellow rethinking his proposal about putting matters on the ballot. God's law was not based on the supremacy of one man. That's just sort of the papal theory. Some say, well, government, God's church, sort of like Catholic Church. No, it's not. No, it's not. You see, in the Catholic Church, the final word is the Pope. He can speak ex cathedra, speak from the chair, and he speaks infallibly. And of course, what has he done? Well, he's thought to change times and seasons, as was prophesied back in the book of Daniel. He's decreed that Sunday it ought to be the day of worship. Christmas is a holy day, and all sorts of things. They've even added books to the Bible, the books of the Apocrypha, if you have a Catholic Bible. I think some of you have a Catholic background. Books of the Catholic Bible are different. They included some extras in. And so that's the idea that, whatever one man says, that's the way it is. You have many of the Protestants that are just the opposite, and they get together and they're going to vote as to whether or not to ordain homosexual or some nutty idea that somebody comes up with. And so if they get the majority of them, well, that's it. See, it's the idea that government is either based on the whim of one or the whim of many, when in reality, God's government is based on neither. God's government is based upon God's law. It's based upon God's Word. And no one has the right to come along and say, well, as the Catholic Encyclopedia brings out and makes the literal statement. You can search the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and you'll find that Saturday is the only day sanctified in Scripture. Yet we all, we Christians, observe Sunday. What's the basis for that? Well, the basis is a particular church council and a decision of the Catholic Church, and they say, we've sanctified it. And they claim to have that authority. Well, God's Word is the supreme authority. God's government is a constitutional government based upon the law of God. You see, when we govern under Christ as kings and priests in the world tomorrow, you're not just going to be able to say, well, I always sort of thought Christmas trees were pretty. I think maybe we'll have them over here in my city. Oh, you won't. You think, they're going to have that over here and somewhere else they're going to come up with some other idea people remember. Say, well, that was sort of nice. No, we're going to be keeping the same days, the same holidays. We're going to be following similar customs and practices because we're going to use the same Constitution, the same law. And so there will be a lot of similarities when you travel from one area of the world to another. You'll find similarities in all sorts of things. Certainly there will be differences of personality. There is room to express individuality, but within the scope of God's law. You're not going to have all these variations in terms of marriage and family and the role of men and women. You're not going to have a big feminist movement over here in this country and somebody else is going to sort of take the Arab model and they're going to think that one man ought to have a bunch of wives and concubines and that ought to be okay. And somebody else thinks that some other idea, maybe they think that one woman ought to have a bunch of men. You can have all sorts of crazy ideas. You can look around the world, and if you look hard enough, you'll find some culture that has practiced just about anything you can dream of. I mean, let's face it, every sort of thing that you can imagine has been practiced and sanctioned by somebody's culture. Everything from headhunting and shrinking the heads of your enemies and sort of hanging them up around, using them for decoration or cannibalism or just about every abominable thing that you could even imagine. Somebody somewhere has done it, and they said, they thought this was a good idea. God's government is government from the top down, based on choices that God makes. It's constitutional, based upon God's law. Everyone must subscribe to that law, that Constitution. And it's also different in that the model for leadership and rulership in God's government is based on the model of a shepherd. Leaders in God's government are to be servants. Christ sought to indelibly bring that home to His disciples on the evening of the final Passover. And He did it in a dramatic way, in a way that is more so than what you and I think of, because when we think of foot washing, we think of something that we do every year at the Passover. But you have to realize that foot washing was not a religious ceremony at the time Jesus introduced it at the Passover service. Foot washing was rather routine, mundane thing because most people went where they went by walking. And it was a customary act of hospitality when someone came to the house, a visitor, a guest came, that you provided him with a basin of water and to wash his feet. And of course, normally it would normally have been the duty of a child or a younger servant to actually perform the act of foot washing, because let's face it, that's not exactly something that really builds your ego, when you're having to kneel down and take somebody's old gnarled foot and wash it and dry it. And that's not something that people are just lining up to do. It was the act of a servant. It was the kind of thing that you tended to pass the buck down until whoever was on the bottom rung was the guy that got to actually carry out the foot washing. Because even among the servants, if you had a servant lower than you assigned him the job. Isn't that human nature? People always looking. If you don't want to do something, you always look around to see if you can find somebody to delegate. We do that. So foot washing was looked upon as a very humble task. It was performed by a lowly servant. The disciples arrived there at the room, and the meal was set, but there were no servants there to serve. And they all had hot, dusty feet, and any one of them could have volunteered. Well, here, Peter, James, why don't you guys take off your shoes and let me go ahead and wash your feet? I bet it'd make them feel better. It didn't occur to any one of the 12 to offer to wash any of the rest of them's feet. They didn't even offer to wash Jesus' feet. He let the meal actually get started. They had already sat down. And then he got up from the table. He gave everybody the opportunity, to volunteer. Nobody was interested in volunteering for something like that. Now, just a few hours earlier, they had been in an argument over which one of them ought to be the greatest. They've been arguing over which one was going to be the most important to have the highest office in the kingdom. And so he waited. He let them all get seated, and then he got up from the table, took off his coat, and picked up a towel and the basin of water, and he began to wash their feet. Can you imagine how embarrassed they must have been about that time? You can just sort of see them all turning red in the face and sort of looking at one another and feeling uncomfortable. This was not something that had ever happened before. And Peter, he looked over, and wherever Christ started, it was like Peter couldn't believe this guy would let Jesus actually stoop down and wash his feet, perform a demeaning task like that, and he piped up and said, "You're never going to wash mine. I'm not going to let you do something like that. Why? You're our teacher. You shouldn't be down doing something like that." Jesus looked at him and he said, "Peter, if I don't wash your feet, you have no part in me." Well, if you explain it that way, go ahead and give me a bath if you've got to. Not my feet, but my head and my hand on my head and my hands. Just give me a bath. He said, "No, it's not necessary except to wash your feet." But he ended up, and he used it to teach them a lesson. His primary purpose wasn't simply to wash their feet physically. He did that, but he made the point. He says, "You call me Master and Lord. You use titles of respect and courtesy in addressing me, acknowledging me as your teacher, as your master, as your Lord, as your ruler. You show me a great deal of respect and deference. And you should," he told them. "That's good." He said, "If I, your master and your Lord, have washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet." You see, he gave them a concept of leadership that was totally different from anything they had ever grasped. We all come along and words have a meaning to us based on the way we've seen those words used and what we think of. It's one of the reasons so many times that people who have come out of a very tragic family background can often have trouble relating to God, because God introduces himself to us as our Father. Now, the word Father immediately summons up a connotation in everyone's mind. The first connotation that you have is what you were introduced to as a child. And sometimes people have a lot of unlearning to do of realizing that they are attaching to God characteristics that God doesn't have, based on maybe a human being who did not properly carry out that responsibility. But words carry a certain connotation based upon our background. When you said king, when Christ talked to the disciples about being kings, about sitting on thrones, well, they were familiar with that. Well, yeah, Herod, he sat on a throne. They knew different kings around. They were very familiar with rulership, leadership. They knew about different kings and different rulers. And what they had to learn was that what they thought they knew wasn't so? Because Christ told him, he said, now you've seen the kings of the Gentiles, they exercise dominion over them. Lordship, they really lay it on. You know how they're impressed with their own greatness. He said, it shall not be so among you. That's not the kind of leadership I'm looking for. You see, the model that Christ uses in both the Old Testament and in the New is the model of a shepherd. So, God's government is from the top down. It is based upon His law, and leaders are to be shepherds. Now, let's go through and let's look a little bit more at this whole idea. Back in Luke chapter 6, verse 13. Luke 6, let's pick it up in verse 12. It came to pass in those days that he went out into a mountain to pray. And he continued all night in prayer to God. And when it was day, he called unto him his disciples, and of them he chose 12, whom also he named apostles. So Christ said, you didn't choose me. We read, that's mentioned back in John 15:16. We read it earlier. Christ said, you didn't choose me. I chose you. How did Christ choose them? Did he just sort of flip a coin? You think, well, this guy, he's got a real neat personality, and he's a lot of fun to be with. This fellow's a good basketball player, and I like to have him around. This fellow, he's he's real popular, and just boy has a really good personality. And no, that's not the way Christ chose them. He didn't choose them based on superficial characteristics. He spent all night in prayer to the Father, because you see, Christ did not want these to be His choices just based on human ideas and attitudes. I really like this guy, and this person has a real good personality, and he's real friendly to me. No, Christ wanted the Father's choice. And He really sought God and asked God for guidance and direction among those disciples, but Christ did the choosing based upon the guidance and the leadership of the Father. And you go down through Scripture, and that's what you find. Now, there certainly were times when, let's go back to Exodus 18. Jethro was Moses' father-in-law, and he's mentioned here in Exodus 18:1. He came to meet Moses, and Moses, verse 7, went out to meet his father-in-law, did obeisance and kissed him, asked each other of their welfare. In other words, Moses showed respect and honor to his father-in-law. And Moses had a very important office. God had chosen him, but he showed honor and respect. Moses told his father-in-law all the things that God had done unto Pharaoh. And Jethro rejoiced, verse 9, for all the goodness that the Lord had done. And then, as we come on down, we find that burnt offerings were offered to God by Jethro, verse 12. And they came, Moses and Aaron, all the elders, came to eat bread with Jethro before God. The next morning, Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood by Moses from morning to evening. Understand, there were 600,000 men, besides women and children. Now, what percentage of those had some issue or some question? 1% would have been 6,000. A half of a percent would have been 3,000. What if Moses only had 0.1%? That would have been 600. 600, if Moses, how long would it have taken Moses? 60 minutes and an hour, so you figure if Moses could move them through a minute, it would have taken him 10 hours. Well, couldn't do that. You can imagine, you had this whole line. It may have been several hundred people lined up, which would have been only a tiny little fraction of the population. But here would been this whole group of people, and poor old Moses, he's out there in the morning, and people are lining up, and they're there all day, and by the time he's worn out and they're ready to shut down for the evening, there's still people that are waiting. And Moses' father-in-law saw what he did, and he asked him, verse 14, he says, what are you doing? Why are you sitting there by yourself alone? And all the people are standing there. And Moses said, I told his father-in-law, he said, the people come to me to inquire of God. They're trying to find out what they ought to do. They have a matter and I judge between one and another, and I make them to know the statutes of God and His laws. Now, I would call your attention to when this happened and what Moses said. There are people who think that the Ten Commandments originated at Mount Sinai. You're not there until you get to Exodus 20. Moses already was able to make the people know God's laws and His statutes. God's laws were already in existence. Abraham had known them, and so had others before him. So he says, well, I explain things to them, and I explain what the principle is and what God would have them do, and I make judgments based on God's law. And Moses' father-in-law said, what you're doing isn't good. You're going to wear yourself away, you and the people. You're going to get worn out, and so are they standing in line. You can't do this by yourself. He says, I'm going to give you some advice, and God will be with you. You be for the people to God, that you may bring the causes to God. You teach them ordinances and laws. Show them the way wherein they must walk and the work that they must do. But what you need to do is provide out of all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, and rulers of hundreds, and rulers of 50s, and rulers of 10. And let them judge the people at all seasons. And it'll be every great matter they'll bring unto you. Every small matter they'll judge. That'll be easier for yourself, and they'll bear the burden with you. So if you will do this thing, and God command you so, He didn't just tell him, you do it because I said so. That, you seek God's will on it, but I think this would be a good idea. If God leads you to do this, then you'll be able to endure it, and all the people will go to their place in peace. And Moses hearkened to the voice of his father-in-law, and he did what he said. He chose able men out of all Israel, made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, hundreds, 50s, 10s. They judged the people, and the hard causes they brought to Moses. The small matters they judged to themselves. Now, again, we see a structure, but the structure originates. Moses chose able men. Christ told His disciples, you didn't choose me, I chose you. The people didn't get together and decide that Moses ought to be in charge. Moses sort of ran for election. Now, Korah thought that'd be a good idea. He was ready to have an election campaign, and he was not planning on, he was sort of a man of the people. Told Moses, he says, you take too much on yourself. You remember the story. Well, the people didn't choose Moses. Rather, Moses chose the men to serve under. Jesus Christ did that in the New Testament. This is the pattern. There are other. Let's notice back in Deuteronomy 1, Moses rehearses this story many years later to the people just a short time before they went in the Promised Land. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but the book of Deuteronomy, if you date it, Deuteronomy 3 verse 1, it was in the first day of the 11th month that Moses spoke to the children of Israel. And if you put the story together, you find out that the book of Deuteronomy covers a period of 40 days. The whole period in the wilderness was 40 years. But it begins on the first day of the 11th month. Covered 40 days. That'd bring you up to the 10th day of the 12th month. Moses died, and the children of Israel spent 30 days in the plains of Moab mourning for Moses. And then they crossed over the Jordan, according to the book of Joshua, on the 10th day of the first month. So, interesting when you put it together. 40 played a significant role in Moses' life. He was 40 years old. First 40 years he was a prince of Egypt. Then he fled to Midian, and he kept his father-in-law's sheep for 40 years. And then when he was 80, he went back and he led the children of Israel out, and he led them for 40 years. 3 periods of 40. And now you come to the book of Deuteronomy, and this is the last 40 days of Moses' life. And he does a lot of reminiscing during that 40 days. And as you go on, he talks about this, and he said, Deuteronomy 1 verse 9, I spoke unto you at that time, saying, I'm not able to bear you myself alone. The Lord your God has multiplied you. And he said, I can't do it by myself. Verse 13, take you wise men and understanding, known among your tribes, and I will make them rulers over you. And the people were pleased. They thought that was a good idea. And so he said, I took the chief of your tribes, wise men and known, made them heads over you, captains over thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens, and officers. And I charged your judges at that time, saying, hear the causes between your brethren, and judge righteously between every man and his brother and the stranger that is with him. You shall not respect persons in judgment. You shall hear the small as well as the great. You shall not be afraid of the face of man, for the judgment is God's. And the cause that is too hard for you, bring it unto me, and I'll hear it. So, one of the things you learn about Moses was in charge because God had put him in charge. Moses didn't volunteer for the job. When God came to Moses, appeared to him and said, Moses, got a job for you, I want you to go back. Moses began to try to get out of it. He said, well, Lord, I don't think I'm up to it. I can't do it. People won't listen. I'm not a real good speaker. And he had all these excuses. Some people who are in charge, and I suspect most of you have known a few folks this way, they were in charge of something, and they viewed every suggestion as a challenge to their authority. You came up with a suggestion. Well, had you thought about doing it this way? I see you're parking the cars this way. You ever thought about if we did it the other way? Do you know who's in charge here? Now, we've all known a few folks that way. Moses was not that way. His father-in-law came up and said, son, this isn't a good idea the way you're doing this. Moses could have flared up and said, well, look, God put me in charge here and you don't have anything to do with it. Moses listened. And he had the humility to say, Dad, you've got a good idea. In fact, what you're suggesting really sounds a lot better than the way I'm doing it. And so he had that humility to listen. That's the mark of a good leader, one who is smart enough to listen to others. That doesn't mean he's just blown to and fro with every wind that blows through, but it means he listens. Moses was certainly an excellent leader. Moses listened. Moses is undoubtedly going to have one of the very highest offices in the world tomorrow. When Christ told the disciples that you'll see me in my kingdom, who appeared with Christ in glory? Moses and Elijah. You get sort of the idea they're going to have pretty high role, pretty high position. God used Moses as the human instrument to mediate the covenant, to give the law, the constitution of ancient Israel, to set up a structure. And it was important. Moses charged these men that they were to be careful. They were to understand that they were to listen. They were to judge righteously between every man and his brother and the stranger that's with him. You were to treat everybody fairly. You're to listen. You're to base it on the facts, whether the man is an Israelite or whether he's a stranger. It doesn't matter. You treat people fairly. You don't take advantage of someone. You don't show special favor. Well, he's my buddy. He's my neighbor. I'm related to him, so I'll go with him. He says you don't respect persons in judgment. You hear the small as well as the great. Don't be afraid of the face of man. Don't be intimidated by people. Don't go along just because somebody is wealthy and powerful, nor it's mentioned back in Exodus, you don't do the reverse. You don't just sort of feel sorry for somebody and give it to them even though they're not entitled to it. See, there are principles of fairness, of equity, of doing what's right, even though what's right may not be popular. So the government was organized from the top down, but you see, it was based not upon what was the most popular decision. Moses did not tell the judges, now, when you have a matter come up, what you need to do is get somebody to go take an opinion poll and find out what's going to be the most popular verdict. And as soon as you sort of figure out which way the wind is blowing and who is most popular, well, that's the direction you need to go. No. You see, that brings us to the second aspect of God's government. It was based not on popularity, not on the whim, either of one or many, but it was based upon God's law, upon God's revelation. Notice back in Deuteronomy 17. Deuteronomy 17, and it says in verse 8, if there arise a matter too hard for you in judgment, between blood and blood, plea and plea, stroke and stroke, being matters of controversy within your gates, there in your local community, you will arise and get you into the place which the Lord your God shall choose. So it was like an appellate process. If you can't make a decision, the matter is too difficult to determine there in the local community within your gates, then you go to the place that God has chosen. And you come, verse 9, unto the priests, the Levites, and unto the judges that shall be in those days. And you inquire, and they shall show you the sentence of judgment. And you shall do according to the sentence which they of that place, which the Lord shall choose, shall show you. You shall observe to do according to all that they inform you, according to the sentence of the law, which they shall teach you, and according to the judgment which they shall tell you, and you shall do. Don't decline from the sentence which they show you to the right hand or to the left. Someone will do presumptuously and won't listen to the priest that stands to minister before the Lord your God or unto the judge. That man will be put to death. Now, verse 14, when you're come to the land which the Lord gives you and possess it, and you decide you want a king like all the nations, verse 15, you shall in any wise set him king over you, whom the Lord your God shall choose. One from among your brethren shall you set king over you. You may not set a stranger over you. It's not your brother. So their leader was to be an Israelite. It was not to be a stranger among them. But it's the one whom God would choose. That's what they were, if you want, this is what they should look to. But notice the king had laws that applied to him. The king was not like the king of Babylon or the king of Egypt, the king of some other country where he was free to just pretty well do what he wanted to. The king was forbidden, verse 16, he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end that he should multiply horses. For as much as the Lord has said unto you, you shall henceforth return no more that way. Neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away. Neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold. It shall be, when he sits upon the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write him a copy of this law in a book out of that which is before the priests, the Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read therein all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the eternal his God, to keep all the words of this law and these statutes, and to do them, that his heart be not lifted up above his brethren, and that he turn not aside from the commandments to the right hand or to the left, to the end that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. So God said, if the king is going to endure, if he wants to endure and to have his dynasty endure, then here's what he better do. Better not put his focus on trying to build up a big army. Better not put his focus on trying to just indulge himself, multiplying women or multiplying gold and silver. Not to be greedy, not to use his office as an opportunity to simply aggrandize himself. No. What he needs to do is make a copy of this book of the law and study. All the days of his life he needs to study the law, because he is in reality a constitutional monarch. In other words, he is ruling in accordance with the law that God has given. And if he does that and really learns to stand in awe of me, then I'll bless him. And if he doesn't, I'll punish him. So here is an important key. You see that government based in God's government, the rulership, the government was based upon the law of God. And there are many, many places we could go through. We'll look at some of them in a few minutes in terms of how this functioned. God's government was from the top down, but it was constitutional government based upon the law of God. Now let's notice something else. Let's go back to Psalm 78. Psalm 78 talks about how God, in verse 68 of Psalm 78, he chose the tribe of Judah, the Mount Zion which he loved. He built his sanctuary like high palaces, like the earth which he has established forever. He chose David also, his servant, and he took him from among the sheepfolds, from following the ewes great with young, and he brought him to feed Jacob his people and Israel his inheritance. So he fed them according to the integrity of his heart, and he guided them by the skillfulness of his hand. When God got ready to choose a king, he chose David his servant. David had good preparation and training to be a king. David was a good shepherd. He chose David from the sheepfold. David was out taking care of the sheep and taking care of the ewes that were getting ready to give birth. And he brought David and made him king. Now, how did being a shepherd prepare David to be king over Israel? Well, you see, what did God want David to do? Verse 71, He brought him to feed Jacob, his people. So, verse 72, what did David do? How did he function as a king? He fed them according to the integrity of his heart, and he guided them by the skillfulness of his hands. So the role of a shepherd was to feed and to guide. David was there to feed them, to instruct them, to teach them the right way, and he was there to guide them. So when we look through the Bible and we find the use of the term shepherd, and you find it over and over. Moses was trained as a shepherd for 40 years. David was a shepherd. You get into the New Testament. What did Christ tell Peter? He said, feed my sheep. Then you find the very term pastor that is used in the New Testament is the Greek word for shepherd, or it's translated. The word pastor is translated from the Greek word for shepherd. Jesus Christ is called the chief shepherd. Peter called him that in the book 1 Peter. Christ, the chief shepherd, shall appear. So the model that we have is that of a shepherd. And the role of the shepherd was to feed and to guide. We see that from King David. Now, let's go on a little further. Let's go on back to Ezekiel. Ezekiel 34. Ezekiel 34, verse 1. The word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say unto them, Thus says the Lord God unto the shepherds, Woe be to the shepherds of Israel that do feed themselves, should not the shepherds feed the flock? Now, when you go through Ezekiel 34 in the context, you find that it is addressed to the leaders of the nation, and I can show you that. It certainly applies. I know some, have taken and applied it to events in the church, and the principle of it certainly applies, because it is a description of the principles of good leadership and bad leadership, and the fact that God holds everyone who is in a leadership capacity accountable. So certainly the principle applies in the church, and there has certainly been some of that's done. But when you go through the context of Ezekiel 34, as you come on down here, where it describes the shepherds and the shepherds of Israel, then God says in verse 20, Thus says the Lord God unto them, unto the shepherds, Behold, even I will judge between the fat cattle and between the lean cattle. You thrust with side and shoulder and pushed all the diseased with your horns, though you've scattered them abroad. I'll save my flock, there will be no more prey. I'll judge between cattle and cattle, and I will set up one shepherd over them, and he shall feed them, even my servant David, he shall feed them, and he shall be their shepherd, and I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David a prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken it, and I will make with them a covenant of peace. I'll cause the evil beast to cease out of the land. And it talks about on down verse 27, the tree shall yield her fruit, the earth yield her increase, they will be safe in their land, and shall know that I am the Lord when I've broken their yoke and delivered them out of the hand of those that chose to serve themselves of them. There will be no more prey. And verse 30, Thus shall they know that I, the Lord, am with them, and that they, even the house of Israel, are my flock. My people, says the Lord. You're my flock, the flock of my pasture. Are men, and I'm your God, says the Lord. So the context refers to the house of Israel. It refers nationally that the leaders of national Israel are certainly, God says, they're characterized by greed. They've ruled in verse 4 with force and cruelty. They have caused damage and hurt. Now, there have certainly been those who have been in rulership positions in spiritual Israel who've done the same thing, and the same indictment applies. If you're in the role of a leader, you're in the role of a shepherd. It may be as a husband and father in your family. It may be as a man who supervises other people at work. It may be an office in the church. It could be those who have offices in government. If you are in a position of power over others, then what God says is that you are to fulfill the role of a shepherd. You are the shepherd over those whom you have under you. It may be your family, or it may be, in any context. Shepherd is used as a metaphor for those who are responsible to guide others. The point is, as you go through Ezekiel 34, it's very clear that God expects leaders to act like shepherds. And leaders who abuse their role are in serious trouble with God. Describes in Ezekiel 37, when it talks, the latter part of Ezekiel 37, when it talks about Israel and Judah being joined back together as one nation. Ezekiel 37:22, I'll make them one nation in the land upon the mountains of Israel, and one king shall be king over them. There will be no more two nations, neither will they be divided into two kingdoms anymore. Neither shall they defile themselves any more with their idols, and with their detestable things, nor with any of their transgressions, but I will save them out of all their dwelling places wherein they've sinned. I'll cleanse them. They'll be my people. I'll be their God. And David, my servant, shall be king over them. And they all shall have one shepherd. They also shall walk in my judgments and observe my statutes and do them. They'll dwell in the land that I've given Jacob, my servant, wherein your fathers have dwelt. And they shall dwell therein, even they and their children's children forever. And my servant David shall be their prince forever. When God sets up David as king, when he regathers Israel and joins the house of Israel and the house of Judah back together again as one nation under King David, David's role is to be a shepherd over them. You see, the model of leadership in God's government is that of a shepherd. Jesus explained in Matthew chapter 20, familiar set of scripture here, to his disciples, just commenting on it earlier, where, as you know, in chapter 20, verse 20, the mother of Zebedee's children with her sons came and were trying to get in on Christ's good side and said, let my sons sit on your right hand and on your left in the kingdom. They were looking for an office, trying to sort of maneuver their way in. And the 10 were moved with indignation, verse 24. Boy, they were stirred up. They were mad. Now, you read some other accounts and you find all 10 of them, all 12 of them had gotten into arguments about which one was going to be the greatest. Main thing these 10 were mad about was that these guys are trying to jump for the head of the line. Jesus called them unto him, and he said, the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them. Boy, they just grind them down. That's what they view as leadership. I'm in charge, and so everybody's here to serve me. That's the way the kings of the Gentiles viewed it. The king, they thought, was here to be served. And if whatever the king was in the mood for, that was what you better do. They exercise dominion. They that are great exercise authority on them. It shall not be so among you. Whosoever shall be great among you, let him be your minister, your servant. He that will be chief among you, let him be your servant. Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many. He said, I've set you an example. I didn't come just seeking to be served. I came to serve you. Jesus Christ humbled himself. He took upon himself the form of a servant. When we look in that regard, that God's government, yes, it's from the top down, to be chosen by God and to be based on God's law. And, how do you know whom God has chosen? Well, God makes it evident by the fruits when he sent Moses back to Israel as their leader. You remember before Moses left, when it was like, who made you a judge and a ruler over us? Who put you in charge? Well, God showed by signs, God showed through clear evidence that Moses was the one that he had chosen when he sent him back. Now, there were those who found fault with that, Korah and Dathan and Abiram and some of their friends. But years ago, we came to understand by the fruits that God had chosen Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong didn't appoint himself to the job. There are a lot of people who tried to appoint themselves to different jobs down through time, but God, through the fruits, showed, through the fruits of Mr. Armstrong's ministry, that's whom God had chosen. And I think we all understood that, recognized that, in the same way, as Mr. Meredith. And, God will evidence by the fruit, by the evidence. There are those who come along. People can hang any title or label on themselves they want to. Christ told the church at Ephesus, you have tried those that say they are apostles and are not, and have found them liars. They were the ones that Paul said that came as false apostles. They came with false doctrine. They came teaching a false message. And so the people rejected them because they said, God didn't choose you. See, God rules according to His law. And if they don't speak according to the law and to the testimony, there's no truth in it. Somebody comes and says the law is done away, well, you don't follow him. You don't follow him out the door. Because God is the one who will make evidence. And Christ said, by their fruits, you know them. You don't gather, when He talked about false prophets, and Christ said, by their fruits, you know them. You don't gather figs from thorns. You will know by their fruits. God's government is by appointment. It's from the top down. It's constitutional government based upon the law of God, and the leaders are to be shepherds. Now, what about us in preparation? Because there's going to come a transition in government. Far greater transition than we're going to have in this country in just a matter of a few weeks. In Psalm 40, David said, this is a psalm of David. David certainly was preparing and did prepare to be a king. Psalm 40, verse 8, he says, I delight to do your will, O my God. Yes, your law is within my heart. God's law is to be the basis of His government. David was in preparation to be a king. David said, your law is within my heart. We understand that we're preparing for a transition. Then one very important part of that is the realization that the law of God must be within our heart. Learning to think like God thinks. Learning to understand and to value and to appreciate those things that are important to God. If we are in the process of making a successful transition to be rulers in the kingdom of God, then it's important that the law of God be in our heart. Notice back in 2 Samuel 23. 2 Samuel 23, verse 1. These are the last words of David. David, the son of Jesse, said, the man who was raised up on high, the anointed of the God of Jacob, the sweet psalmist of Israel said, the Spirit of the Lord spoke by me, and His word was in my tongue. The God of Israel said, the rock of Israel spoke unto me, he that rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. He that rules over men must be just, must be fair, ruling in the fear of God, standing in awe and reverence of God. And if you really stand in awe and reverence of God, then you're not going to be intimidated by people and swayed by what everybody else thinks you ought to do. Because what God thinks will be more important to you than what everyone or anyone thinks. You see, God wants His law, His government filled with individuals who will faithfully carry out the spirit and the intent of God's law. He that rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God, standing in awe and reverence of God. And that, if he does, verse 4, he'll be as the light of the morning when the sun rises, even a morning without clouds, as the tender grass springing out of the earth by clear shining after rain. You know how welcome a beautiful sunshine is? You know, you've had rain and then the sun rises. And how beautiful and how wonderful that is. Someone who's ruling in the fear of God, who's being just, they'll be like the light of the morning when the sun rises. They'll be a welcome sight. They will bring forth growth. You see, what happens? It rains, and then you have some beautiful sunshine. The sun comes up. What happens? Well, everything begins to grow. You know, if it's the grass begins to grow, everything begins to grow. You have rain followed by sunshine. You know, a nation or a kingdom that has a man or men, has individuals who are just, ruling in the fear of God, it's going to be the same thing. That government will encourage growth and prosperity and abundance because things will be fairly done and people will not be being swayed by corruption and by greed and by being enticed as to who's going to pay the biggest bribe. But they're going to rule in the fear of God. The transition that's going to take place in a few years when the government of God comes in, one of the reasons that so many of these problems are going to be swept away is because the law of God will be supreme. And the individuals who will be carrying that out will have the law in their heart. And they will rule in the fear of God, standing in reverence and awe of God, not just trying to run a popularity contest with people. Now notice how this was intended to function in ancient Israel, and realize how much, to how much greater extent it'll function in the time ahead. In Deuteronomy chapter 21, Deuteronomy 21 describes problem, an unsolved crime. And verse 5, the priest, the sons of Levi, shall come near. For them the Lord your God is chosen to minister unto him and to bless in the name of the Lord. And by their word shall every controversy and every stroke be tried. So God assigned to the priests, the Levites, the role of judging and of applying his law. In Deuteronomy 19, it talks about different things that come up. Talks about people trying to cheat each other and witnesses arising. Verse 16, if a false witness rise up against any man to testify against him that which is wrong, then both the men between whom the controversy is shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges which shall be in those days. And the judges shall make diligent inquisition. They're not to just jump to conclusions. There's this whole comedy routine about the fellow who was the arbitrator. He was going to be, he was an arbitrator. And these two folks had made up to come get their dispute arbitrated. And only one of them had gotten to him ahead of time, so he sort of paid him off. So they come to state their case, and he calls on one to go first, and he states his case. As soon as he states his case, the old arbitrator hammers down his gavel and says, I find in his favor. Well, the second fellow never even got a chance to state his case. And he gets upset, and he says, well, wait a minute, you only heard one side. He says, in all my years as an arbitrator, I've always found that if I only listen to one side of the story, I never have trouble making up my mind. Now, I listen to both sides, and I sometimes get confused. But if I only listen to one side, I never have trouble making up my mind. Proverbs says, he that's first in his own cause seems just. You ever notice that? Well, parents, you ever had your kids, one of them comes running in, and he's telling his story, and the way he tells it, it sounds like he's 100% in the right. But then comes the other. And as Paul Harvey says, then you hear the rest of the story. Oh, a few details sort of left out. That's human nature, you see. The priests and the judges were to what? They were to make diligent inquisition. They were to diligently search out the facts. Not to just jump to conclusions, not to go along with the first fellow that came. Somebody comes and, boy, he seems right. He's got his story all down, and you just think he must be right. No need to listen to the next fellow, case closed, we'll just go. No. God gave instruction to those who were standing for him. He said, you bring these men, and they're being really brought before God. They stand before the Lord, before the priests and the the judges make diligent inquisition. They really search out to get the facts. And if the witness is a false witness that testifies falsely against his brother, you know what the punishment was? Then shall you do unto him as he had thought to do unto his brother. Oh, the punishment for being a false witness, the punishment for perjury was whatever the punishment would have been to the other fellow if your false testimony had been believed. From a scriptural standpoint, perjury was serious business. And the judges that God set would not have been impressed by arguing about what is means. I don't think the rulers that God set were going to be impressed by something like that. Made diligent inquiry, try to find out the facts, and then if you weren't telling the truth, you're in serious trouble. Whatever it was that you were going to get the other fellow into, that's what's going to be done to you. Better hope it's not a capital case, huh? because it was a serious business. And then it says, the result, verse 20, those which remain shall hear and fear. Yeah, word will get around. You better not be doing something like that, because those judges are going to make diligent inquiry. They're going to find out the facts, and then they're going to deal with the fellow who came with a false story. Let's go one more place. Let's go back to 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles chapter 17 is the story of Jehoshaphat. And we find that in verse 6, his heart was lifted up in the ways of the Lord. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he sent to his princes, and he sent Levites, verse 8. And what were they to do? Verse 9, they taught in Judah and had the book of the law of the Lord with them. And they went about throughout all the cities of Judah and taught the people. You see, government in God's kingdom is to be based on teaching as well as carrying out the law. It was government from the top down, but it was constitutional government based upon the law of God. And the leaders were to function as shepherds, as servants. We need to be filling our hearts and minds with God's ways so that we're preparing for the time of transition when Jesus Christ will return to this earth as King of Kings. There's not going to be some great confusion and recounting of recounts. Jesus Christ is going to come, and He's going to take it. And He's going to set over that kingdom as kings and priests. Those who are preparing for that transition. Those who are faithful and endure to the end. So, as we look about us in the world today, we're going to see a lot of confusion and a lot of problems, and it's going to get worse. But we need to have our eyes set on the government that is going to solve, finally, the problems of this world. The government of God. You and I need to be putting that into practice in our personal lives and our families right now, and preparing for the time when we will have a chance to assist Jesus Christ in bringing to the whole